the Wilson Forum. Today we're going to talk about the history of industrial revolutions. And I just want to give you a little bit of background on how we came to this discussion. The seeds for today's presentation began last fall when Tom Haupert, who is sitting with us today in North Carolina, was in Winchester visiting with me and with Carolyn. And Vince Dixon suggested that he thought that Tom and I and he would enjoy a visit to the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation, which is in Waltham. And so, typical of our speaker today, Vince led us to the museum. He thought we'd enjoy it, and in fact, we all did enjoy it enormously. It led us to think about the fact that in industrial revolutions that really represent the core of the museum's efforts, beginning with the textile revolution in the 1800s, led by Francis Lowell. That revolution is manifest today in a much bigger, I don't know if you call it a revolution or an evolution or how we would want to describe the growth and transformation of our lives due to artificial intelligence. But there is another revolution occurring. And we thought we ought to start by talking about the impact of industrial revolutions historically. And then on June 27th, when we wrap up our season, we're going to talk more fully about where we are today with AI. So that's the seed of how we began this whole effort at the museum. And Vincent and I visited with the leadership of the museum a couple of times. And we're going to start today with a short video from the Director of Education, whose name is Steve Guerrero, who, at the museum. He's gonna give us a short introduction, and then we'll turn to Vince. So let me share that introduction, and we'll listen to Steve for a moment. And then we'll go back to Vince. So here's Steve Guerrero, the Director of Education at the museum.
Hi everyone, my name is Steve Guerrero and I'm the Director of Education here at the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation in Waltham. I'm really pleased to welcome the Wilson Science and Tech Group into our space, and I'd love to share a little bit about our history and our museum. Our museum, the Charles River Museum, is built next to the Charles River, but we are better known as the National Historic Landmark District, where Francis Cabot Lowell kicked off the American Industrial Revolution at scale. Here, his Boston Manufacturing Company, founded in 1813, built the first modern factory in the world. What do I mean by that? The first place where raw material came in this case raw cotton, and finished textiles went out. Done at scale with a single workforce, a single power source, which was water wheels in the Charles, and under a single corporate entity, which was the Boston Manufacturing Company. The first joint stock company and the first large-scale private corporation in America. We also tell the story of technological advancement. So Francis Cabot Lowell and Paul Moody built the first reliably working power looms at scale, as well as the first industrial workforce made up of what's called now the mill girls. These are young women from all over New England who were brought here to Waltham, housed by the company, educated by the company, and worked from about 5 a.m. until sundown, 6 days a week here in the textile mills. As Francis Cabot Lowell's company grew, he unfortunately passed away in 1817 at age 42. But the company kept going for over 100 years after that. Around the 1820s, they exhausted the water power possible from here at the Charles and moved up north to a town called Chelmsford at the time, where you might find the Merrimack River. There, at Pawtucket Falls, they found a great space for expansion, and that's where the Boston Manufacturing Company established the Merrimack Manufacturing Company, which later established the city of Lowell. In fact, the National Rangers at Lowell National Park lovingly call us here in Waltham the mothership. There was another innovation here in labor history, and that is the first industrial labor strike. So in 1821, the corporate leaders here at the Boston Manufacturing Company were cutting workers' pay, maybe in anticipation of scaling up in Lowell. They cut the machinists' pay, mostly men, and they went back to work the next day. According to a machinist here, Isaac Markham, writing to his brother in May of 1821, he says the corporate leaders tried to play the same trick off on the girls, and they, as one, revolted, and the work stopped for 2 days. And that's the first documented industrial labor strike in American history, and it was done by these remarkable young women right here on our site in Waltham. We also talk about 200 years of innovation in technology, labor, and changes in the way that we live and work. We also talk about the rise of the industrial working class, even their leisure activities, which is why we have a couple of canoes in our collection, which was part of the leisure class here on the Charles. We talk about a company called Waltham Watch, or the American Watch Company, depending on the time period. Waltham Watch pioneered precision machining. They were able to make really accurate, reliable pocket watches that kept perfect time and do so at factory scale. In fact, Henry Ford came to Waltham and visited Waltham Watch. And by what he saw, he was inspired to build assembly lines and also use interchangeable parts in ways that made automobiles accessible to the working class. His grandson later told the New York Times in the 1950s that Henry Ford really did get his inspiration from his visit to the Waltham Watch Company here. While Waltham Watch wasn't here in our building, it was just about 10 minutes upriver on the Charles from here. We also talk about this remarkable group of women who worked at Waltham Watch. When the company closed in the 1950s, they went to a defense company called Raytheon. And later, in the 1960s, those same women who had incredible skills with dexterity and precision work were drafted into the Apollo space mission. And they helped hand wire all the memory core rope that was powering the Apollo space mission and got us to the moon. That is not a far stretch to go from pocket watches to the Apollo space mission to the digital revolution. And in fact, we house the archives of the Boston Computer Society, which helped popularize the personal computer in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. So as you can see, we have more than a little history on our site. The Wilson Science and Tech Group is a great match for us because we're talking about how history can inform and guide our future developments with technology and how technology changes the way we live. I'm really excited to have Vince and Ron and the Science and Tech Group with us here for these conversations, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Vince. Thanks so much.
Great. Well, that gives you a really nice introduction to what the Waltham Museum of Industry and Innovation is all about. And it's so consistent where we are today in terms of the fact that technology and the revolution that's represented by artificial intelligence affects our culture, it affects our economy, it will affect our entire way of life. So this is a very good, I think, launching point for us to talk about the impact of AI going forward, which we'll do on June 27th. But I want to turn the flow over now to our speaker, Vince Dixon. Vince is the resident historian of the Wilson Forum. And Vince, the floor is yours. Welcome back, and we're looking forward to your comments, Vince.
Good morning. Morning to everyone who's on the call. I do know most of you, and welcome to the others. And we look forward to this. There's been some technical issues developing, but we're reaching out, and I think the program is getting stronger here. This is the history of industrial revolutions, and Ron nicely kind of gave the bridge for how we got going here. Because among other things, many people tend to think of this and us as living in the Industrial Revolution era, when in fact, like most parts of human history, there have been a series of industrial revolutions, and we will look at them and number them as we go through this presentation, which we should think of as kind of an exploration. It's ambitious to look at the entire picture, but I think coming away from this presentation, you should have a sense of that different periods of time happen. Sometimes it seems like there's not much happening. We have sort of a stable state of society or economics, but then suddenly revolutions occur, and AI, in fact, is the next one that we're entering into step by step, perhaps a few too many steps at once. I am Vincent Lawrence Dixon. I'm a historian, and mass presentations is the doing business as that I often use for my presentations. Next. We are certainly an informal, voluntary, ad hoc interest group. Took a little bit of explanation to explain that to the folks at Charles River, but in the end, it turns out they and we are dedicated to a common principle here of educating people about progress, thinking about where all this goes, and exploring scientific developments. And we certainly started, we have our base in Winchester, but I like to kind of use the term Greater Winchester, reaching out to North Carolina and beyond. Next. This is your friendly historian. Our camera doesn't work quite the way we would like, so here's a picture of what I look like at a formal event some years ago. My background is of interest to some people because it is different. Homeschooled from kindergarten through high school by my parents, an associate in arts and Bachelor of Arts cum laude from Harvard University Extension School, a Master of Education from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and additional work in economics at Radcliffe Institute and in church and state at Harvard Law School. I studied with Dr. Thomas H. O'Connor, who was a longtime dean of Boston historians. If you look him up, there's some great books he wrote about Boston history. Next. This is an exploration, and it will be further developed, but from textiles at the Charles River site through the innovations that sometimes happen good and bad in war, health, through navigation, radar, computers, chips, and on into artificial intelligence. Not only are these remarkable waves of revolution changing society in different ways, but so much of it has been here in the Boston area. There is a sociological sense, there's technology, there are socioeconomic effects, and what is the future, which often intrigues or inspires people. Don't forget, there have been throwback revolutions, and further work can be done on this, but there was the Copper Age, then the Bronze Age, then the Iron Age. And these are, in fact, what are sometimes called the three metals ages as progress develops. And with due respect to various religious and philosophical systems, the Judeo-Christian and Muslim monotheistic cultures have had a role here, and other developments, including calendars, science, and mathematics. And some of the earliest calendars appear to go back just before Stonehenge, which is a calendar of a kind, and the Gregorian calendar that we use today. And part of these effects and changes are the changes and declines in prior philosophical systems, which are as important as the rise of new ones. These I call throwback revolutions because people don't always think about them. You kind of hear obscure, dusty museum cases talking about the Copper Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and the artifacts, but they were important in the advance of different types of civilization. Courtesy of Wikipedia, which has gathered all of these, and the incredible numbers of historians, classical and more recent, there are pre-industrial technologies or the Stone Age, but the Stone Age did actually come back into or come further into the modern age more than people might think. The first agricultural revolution, the Copper Age. Copper Age leads and is synonymous with a development of urban revolutions, the concentration of people in various centers, then the Bronze Age, then the Iron Age, and then we come to the modern age. And you see, this is where we're working our way through. We'll number these a little further. Next. What is an industrial revolution? I think here is kind of a taxonomy, if you will, and we can see the age we're in fading away into the new one. First is kind of an idea. Obviously, in the case of bronze or iron, it was a material that had different characteristics that led to dominance by those who had it, and the failure of those who didn't. There's some further in development of the idea, and in more recent years, it involves the intersection of science, government, research, the moral land-grant institutions, including MIT, privately funded research, and application development, with some commercialization, and then some intersection, more and more so, with financial mechanisms and market mechanisms. Then also the development of transportation connections, which may be important in bringing raw materials in or transporting finished product, or services that develop in relation to that, the purchase of products in a broader marketplace, and ultimately the integration into the societal context. So when we were growing up, a computer, or for some of us who are a little older perhaps, mainframe computers would occupy an entire room. Today, we've gone through phases where now we have a computer in our pocket that serves as calendar, as watch, as computer, as connection to the World Wide Web, perhaps sometimes a little more annoying than a beeper. It's amazing how these things happen. Next. The Copper Age was emerging from the Stone Age and the development of smelting a metal. The urbanization did have critical value, which we have still today. We saw the issues that came up with the pandemic, with the concentration of human intercommunication, meeting people, having a beverage, thinking face to face, or now through other electronic means. And we've struggled with some of those issues even today, as schools are reporting deteriorated performance from the gap that happened during the pandemic of students and teachers actually meeting face to face. So these issues actually do reoccur from time to time in places we don't always think of or expect. The Bronze Age went beyond with an alloy, and this is where now smelting and other processes become more complex, still perhaps crude for our eyes, but some of these processes are still the underlying aspect of what we do. Writing systems and the development of them were important. Cuneiform, Mesopotamia, hieroglyphs in Egypt, and the development of various systems, which allows the creation of monuments and records and other forms of communication across distance as well as time. The Iron Age, perhaps originally meteoric iron, smelted iron, eventually steel, materials we still use today in various ways and various uses. We are looking here, this presentation, at how industrial revolutions have changed societies. We've touched on that already. And as time develops, of course, different modalities. Transportation is not something that people necessarily intended to intersect with technology, but surely has done so. We've looked at iron and bronze and copper. Copper is in the news in recent days because we may not have pennies anymore, or at least not made for a while. But copper actually, if you look at the markets, has a 17-year cycle. So everyone thinks they've gotten rid of copper, and then it turns out it's usable yet again, and it's used in many communications today in ways we don't always see. As populations have changed and been changed by transportation and technology, moral compasses have been transformed. As we look forward, how will work change is one of the things that happens with how industrial revolutions occur and change their societies as well as be changed. The Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation is a remarkable artifact and a living communication about some of those aspects. It's at 154 Moody Street. If you know Moody Street in Waltham, you go over a bridge by the dam there off to the side. You have to park on the other side of the river and cross over. It's a remarkable saving of what might well have been demolished as just an old brick building, because there's a lot of sociological information, economic information, and other aspects, not just in textiles. This is the inside of the power plant of that museum, a remarkable space. It is available and used for special events. This evening, there's a free program on harpsichords because it turns out at a later point, harpsichords were being made in this complex as well. In fact, hundreds of harpsichords over time. There's a little feedback from somebody back there. Okay, next. We don't have any portraits of Mr. Lowell, but we do have this sole image, which is a silhouette. If anyone's ever been to an old-time show, there used to be silhouette artists. Intriguing enough is that Francis Cabot Lowell was born right at the cusp of the United States becoming fully independent in Newburyport, Mass. He did pass away, his whole family, from the plagues and diseases of the time, but his partners continued what he had done. This is the semi-quincentennial, not only of his birth, but of course of the United States and the events here. And he developed a remarkable range of ideas, both technical and financial. He had traveled to England and seen what the British were doing in terms of developing what we know of as the city of Manchester. I had the opportunity some years ago to see those earlier brick buildings and other facilities, and they had heard in Manchester, England, about what Senator Songus was doing in Lowell, Mass, to create a tourist site that explained how the Industrial Revolution grew. At the time, Manchester, England was not sharing that information. Francis Cabot Lowell actually had a nearly photographic memory, and when he came back without any documentation, he was able to hire individuals to help make machines and put together the management system that led to this great integrated manufacturing system. This is the set of buildings that came about right on the Charles River. Remarkable, and quite fortunate that part of the building has been saved as residences, so other space can be used as a museum and some other community space. It's a beautiful and remarkable construction. Remember, this was the early 1800s that this came into being and becomes the model for the next century and a half, and in some ways, some of the assembly line work that is still done in many places today. Another view of that mill and the Charles River, the water power, the dam right behind this picture. The second agricultural revolution occurred, it's estimated from about 1670 to 1770, and through various ways of production and attention to farms, the agricultural production came to increase faster than the population. People were eating better, feeling better, life lengthened a bit, and food and commerce arrangements changed. And this made possible a lot of other changes as well. The first industrial revolution, surely textiles, and then brought here, and fully integrated manufacturing, as the director of education noted. You started with raw cotton coming in, and at the other end of the processes and the assembly lines, essentially, were finished textiles. And that, of course, changed a lot because it also changed economics. Instead of people making one or two garments at home that they wore most of the time, now people could have multiple changes of clothes at less cost. And they were now new jobs, so those new jobs weren't always the best circumstances. Because of the nature of textiles, they had to keep the factories at a higher temperature with a higher degree of moisture, and that led to various disease problems among the workforce. And the mill girls were not being treated well. They did, in fact, resist cuts to their wages in Waltham successfully, and eventually led to the struggles in Lowell, and then ultimately the successful Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence in 1912, where it was finally settled that women and children would be made to work no more than 12 hours a day. Radical, obviously, for its time and the mill owners, but it led to transformations in many ways. If we go back a slight bit, in essence, elements of machines were coming into being with printing, and the discoveries and developments of Johannes Gutenberg, movable type, led to printing of scriptures And to some extent, you have the capacity and the intersection, because for those who were religious and seeking to educate people to a particular viewpoint, the availability of multiple copies that now could be in people's hands meant it wasn't just a monk writing or copying out the Bible over a period of 20 or 30 years, a lifetime perhaps in those days, but now the mass production of printed copies of the scriptures that led to a lot else as well. A lot of these influences do appear to have come, at least the rumors of them, from Asia by way of traders and Arab traders in the Middle East. Ultimately, the four discoveries that have some influence from Asia: the compass, gunpowder, papermaking, and printing, that do transform society, particularly in Europe, in different political ways of organizing and commercial trading mechanisms. Next. Language, of course, has always had a role. Verbal language we take of from theater today, and we kind of take for granted. But written languages became important, and we still occasionally, or sometimes more than occasionally, use Greek and Latin in ways people aren't always aware. Approximately 1,000 words a year are created, most of them in science, and they are often combinations or root words that suggest something from Greek or Latin. English is actually a world language, and the very term red tape is the ribbons that were used to hold together the bureaucratic records of the English bureaucracy. There's always also the struggle that we hear of echoed here today. And in many countries, you must speak X or Y, mandatory languages versus voluntary languages, and how they get regulated. So the New American Dictionary of Noah Webster was about the usage of words, whereas in France or some other countries, the Ministry of Culture monitors what words will be allowed to be taught by teachers and the sanctions that go with it. So this is another zigzag in terms of culture and various systems and cultural dominance or cultural weaknesses. These are a sequence that seems a little bit marching through, because it is. The first, the second, the third, the fourth. We are probably in the fourth industrial revolution, transiting out rather quickly into the fifth, and there will be, perhaps beyond the lives of many of us, the sixth industrial revolution, which at this point is largely science fiction. But as many have said, science fiction is what often becomes science fact. And the sixth industrial revolution surely will be very different than even what we can imagine. Next. The first industrial revolution did include this mechanized textile production, the intersection with transportation networks, some of which we can see around us. For those who know the Middlesex Canal system, which linked ultimately Lowell, Lawrence, the Merrimack River, came through here in Winchester and on to Boston. This canal construction was a very strong thing in the early 1800s. If you go out by Kendall Square near the electric plant, you'll see the beginning of a massive canal that never got completed, but it was quite the thing. Toll roads, you have a street named after a community. Oftentimes these were businesses run by families where they straightened out a road or built a new road and collected tolls, eventually acquired by state or local authority. And then there were other commercial links that quickly led to railroad networks. Water power in New England was valuable because there's a fall line where the water descends from the mountains and various lakes and ponds along the way towards the ocean. And that fall line creates the gravity that creates the power system. Eventually, when you have not just floods, which can damage your plant, but the droughts where there's not enough power coming through, that meant that steam engines became more reliable in terms of continuing to produce without having to stop when there's a drought. There are the various factory systems that we talked about being developed, and that was an important part here, not just the manufacturing, but the system of assembly line that Ford and others brought to their greatest successes. Along the way, there were also, for various reasons, including these changes in the legal system, Go back, please. And one of those was the ending of prisons. If you had a business and it failed, you could declare bankruptcy and perhaps start another business. I knew somebody who was a very good venture capitalist and advisor who said that his second business was a success and it paid for the debts of his first business. This limited liability concept, which has evolved over time, created a much more dynamic marketing system. The American Civil War is kind of a bridge period. In many ways, it was a full precursor of World War I and its technologies. The extensive use of railroads for troop movements, metal ships, aerial observation, modern siege uses, semi-automating weapons. Along the way, there was the expanded use of philosophical public education techniques, sports, concepts such as freedom, emancipation, unions, and teamwork, and changes in the legal system, including an odd little one that we still hear discussed today, and that's absentee ballots, which probably helped President Lincoln to get the votes of soldiers at the front that might have otherwise not been able to vote in their local communities. These are all periods. You get a period where technology kind of saturates and stabilizes, but then what happens next are these bridge periods next. The second industrial revolution after the Civil War, post-bellum is sometimes called, mechanization is further. No longer is it just the machines being monitored and even run by humans, but now increasingly machines automated enough that they're only needing to be checked on occasionally. The production line, the fuller developments, and then the railroads that are fully built out, the Transcontinental Railroad connecting the entire United States as we understand it, the remarkable development of refrigerated freight food cars, a connection here in Boston. Within a matter of a few years, it leads to 3,000 carcasses a week being able to be sent refrigerated for further cutting by butchers and distribution through food networks. And this transformed food and the ability to move food across longer distances and from different places. In the meantime, the farms themselves are being transformed by agricultural machinery, which is a revolution that has transformed farms in so many ways. A growing intersection with education, the moral land grant institutions, MIT, the ag techs, the state universities, the normal schools. Well, okay, so we need people to read, to write, to learn things. How do we teach them? In many cases, who knew? So, in fact, if we buy the Lexington Green, you will see that revolution started right there at a later point. Creation of technical schools to teach technical skills, not necessarily academic, and the transformation of secondary schools that now have both academic tracks and technical tracks. This is a picture of that, an earlier postcard. Somewhere in the 1840s, this building begins to have the first normal school. If you know the Lexington Green, literally about 200 yards northeast of the Lexington Green is this other revolutionary building. The program of the normal school here eventually transforms into what becomes Framingham State University, a whole series of normal and then teacher colleges that Massachusetts had that then add additional programs as well. The second industrial revolution includes, of course, during the Civil War, greater use of the telegraph. Lincoln would go to the telegraph office to see news from the front and figure out where they were going to use their resources next, and telegraph transforms that. Transforms information in many ways. Parallel and overlapping in some ways is the invention and development of the telephone here in Boston. And the first long-distance call from Boston to Cambridge by a wire that I think is about a 2.5-mile wire, rather remarkable also. And the first electrification comes along. Now we are in a second wave of electrification. If you see police details along the road with electrical utility trucks, what's happening is a tremendous, not incremental, but multiplication of electrical use at homes, in businesses, in various communications, which is important and particularly important for New England's power grid and the production and importation of electricity as needed. The production line during this late 1800 and early 1900 continues to evolve, and this Waltham community, as noted with the Waltham Watch Group, inspired Henry Ford in his assembly line approach. The land grant institution was a tremendous breakthrough. Had some problems, I think, with the financing at the beginning. Some Native American land was sold for the purpose, though they have now established in many Native American nations their own colleges and some training. People inspired by this have also created later on the Sea Grant, including MIT as one of the first, and the connection with Woods Hole Institute, Space Grant Program, and Sun Grant Program. An interesting development with the Woods Hole Institute is a Japanese researcher working here discovered bioluminescence of a particular algae in the sea, and that's now used in laboratory research. Specifically, you can look at a set of samples and with bioluminescence understand which samples are working and which are not, which has speeded research tremendously. A Japanese researcher here, international effort that has led to tremendous speeding up of medical research. The land grant first moral act was in 1862. Eventually, we've talked about having a program on the moral land grant institutions and the successors. Essentially, what was gradually copied was aspects of what were going on and developed in Prussia and then Germany in the government funding research for practical application needs and realities, basic research to some extent, but primarily applications. And so the United States in some ways imitated the productivity of German industry and research to our benefit, and we proceeded to do that brilliantly. Of course, these are issues that some people discuss today on the side, but very much part of the central of our system and our rural America's role in science in the world. There's a period of what I call a combination of economic digestion and indigestion, a recovery from World War I in various ways, the economic boomlet of the Roaring '20s, then the Great Depression, and political chaos that resumed for a while. World War II, of course, happens at the end of this, or in part because of the chaos of this. Some worry that we're in a similar period a century later. Some think there are 50-year cycles up and down. I'll leave that to another presentation, but this is in looking at the sequences that one might have. The seasons of civilization, much broader cycles than the seasons of a year. The Third Industrial Revolution at the end of World War II, now that countries are either exhausted or successful, you have the entry of electronics, the further development of worker training, higher quality vocational education schools, and other aspects. The materials research and applications that MIT and many of the engineers on this call and others know of, further computerization, and the software revolution that transforms, in many of the records of the Boston Computer Society, started by a young fellow, are at the museum that we're developing a partnership with. The information age, of course, is what develops from all of this. Then we have databases. Then we can do more research, more mathematical analysis, and hybridize culture and science in many different ways. And you begin to hear more questions about what are the guardrails. There are, of course, significant connections with so-called military applications, nuclear weapons, distinct from nuclear power, aerospace, substantial further materials development into many of the rare earth element uses we have today. Fuel cells are an interesting example. Electricity in space that has been mostly successful for decades. some development here on Earth, space from an experimental to a new dimension to further wiring the planet via space. We are in the fourth industrial revolution, computerization and more. Are we crossing over? Likely we are. From the fourth industrial revolution, there's an increasing transience of work and employers, increasing income and wealth inequality, and these are developments that happen with any industrial revolution, that those who are ahead of the curve at the right point wind up with wealth and income. Those who are behind need education and technical skills to catch up, and eventually you reach a point of stability within a society before the next bridge and the next industrial revolution. AI migrating into life, struggling for definitions. What is AI? How are we going to use it as a tool for humans? And there are drastic wealth malformations depending upon your view. And in fact, basic income, interestingly enough, comes about partly because of this, and there are actual experiments underway in terms of that. And whatever one thinks of it, at one point, Bill Gates was worth the equivalent of the bottom 160 million Americans. And what about the other 150 who have a much higher wealth level? And what about the middle class that we tend to at least sentimentally treasure? And this leads to other issues. So there's an intersection yet again with technology of various kinds and with social behaviors or what we might hope for. Is this Monday through Friday or Monday through Thursday, or is it the weekend? What can we do? What are our choices? What choices will be available? What choices will be allowed or regulated? And how will that occur? We have in our fifth industrial revolution already clear examples of it. Smart systems, smart watches, smart glasses have just been announced coming out soon. Are we so smart? Next. This sixth industrial revolution will be the next one. Some of us will be here, some of us not. Where will we go? There will be routine space travel already developing, regular extraterrestrial travel, possible interplanetary travel. Individual societies will change, carve off from others, merge. World economics will change. There will be, of course, some people who say, I don't like this. I told you it was a wrong thing. I would call them the postmodern Luddites. For those who may not know, the Luddites were a group in England who went about smashing machines, not realizing the machines were actually going to create more jobs. And then you have to look at more subtle and subjective issues that are moral economic development issues. In doing research for this, I ran across the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty, named after the great English historian, Lord John Acton. Lived in the 1830s through the beginning of 1900, best known for the famous remark, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Inspired by his work on the relation between liberty and morality, the Acton Institute seeks to articulate a vision of society that is both free and virtuous, the end of which is human flourishing. We should hope as much. Next. Challenging philosophical aspects. Who knew? The church that created the Gregorian calendar, I will note I'm an Episcopalian, not a Catholic, Pope Leo XIV, turns out to be perhaps Pope of the AI age. Rerum Novarum was written around 1890 by Pope Leo XIII, and you'll see here there's a source that notes, with Rerum Novarum as the cornerstone of the church's dialogue with contemporary social concerns. In so many words, former Cardinal Prevost explained his choice of name in his first meeting with the College of Cardinals. He said while there were different reasons, it was mainly because of Pope Leo XIII, since in his historic encyclical Rerum Novarum, he addressed the social question in the context of the first great industrial revolution. Remember that Chicago is well known for having had a variety of social thinkers, whether you're talking about actors like Jane Addams and Hull House, Saul Alinsky, a community organizer, and many others as well. Interesting to draw on that. Next. This is fully beautiful art from the Middle Ages, hand done in many cases, and yet a pope for our postmodern era, and historians do call this the postmodern era. More specifically, the new pope confessed among the most critical of the new socio-phenomena is AI. In our own day, the church offers everyone the treasury of its social teaching in response to another industrial revolution and to developments in the field of artificial intelligence that pose new challenges for the defense of human dignity, justice, and labor. Copyright training issues. Whoever knew? How do we train AI mechanisms? What of copyrights? How do we compensate training something, a non-human entity of some sort, with copyrighted material, and how do we charge for that, or how do we allow that as would be allowed in an educational context? Next. There are various issues of public debate, and this is just a short list, but I think they are central to what the Pope is talking about, to what secular thinkers are talking about, to what lawyers and others are thinking about. We need to consider the ethical and moral standards. We need to consider the intersection with law and legal systems. As Ron and others have pointed out, to guard against what I'm going to call AI pollution of legal systems, developing clear guardrails in the use of AI, protecting against abuse of children and young people, regulating the use of AI in education. AI could be used in a constructive way, but should not be abused or used to eliminate the capacity for critical thinking being developed, and monitoring the misuse or abuse of customers in the marketplace. One result of all of this is, again, as I've noted, the malformations of wealth leads to issues that are called basic income issues. Interestingly, a group in Cambridge, England, and a program pilot in Cambridge, Mass, have moved beyond just conceptual discussion to exploring actual programmatic implementation and behavior analysis. This is not to say that this is a complete solution, but surely it is a subject area that there is a socioeconomic pathway that we will and are on. The Basic Income Cambridge, Mass program in September of 2021, called the Recurring Income for Success and Empowerment Guaranteed Income Pilot. There is a link below here you can look up on universal basic income, and interestingly enough, surprising to many, is that Milton Friedman, a well-known, established conservative economist, actually had thoughts on this. There's a new book pending regarding Milton Friedman, a biography that explores many aspects of his life and his thinking, including basic income thinking. This is a Stanford scholar who has taken on really a complex and rather detailed biography that's well worth reading, I'm sure, when it comes out. It's designed to address growing economic disparities. Cambridge Rise provided $500 recurring monthly payments for 18 months to 130 randomly selected single caretaker households living below 80% of the area median income. The Center for Guaranteed Income Research conducted a mixed methods randomized controlled trial, and there is a fuller report that I don't think it gives a determination or decision on what one might do, but it's an interesting guidepost or signpost along the way. There is a mill talk that I believe has happened at the Charles River Museum, and this is a new lunar society, an enlightenment guide to the Industrial Revolution, presented by David Mindell, Professor of Aerospace Engineering and Dibner Professor of the History of Engineering and Manufacturing at MIT. As I understand the program, that's an interesting program and well worth the read. Next. We are an informal, voluntary, ad hoc interest group exploring scientific developments, and I think well constituted to think about where all of this goes. Thank you, and I hope that this gives you a sense of an overall view. There are many details to be further explored. I had the pleasure of taking this on, complex. This is certainly not a simplification of a vast array, but as I said, an exploration. And I certainly thank Ron for being excited by this. And Steve Guerrero, our host at the Charles River Museum, has been quite enthusiastic about working with us. And we will certainly go further with this. And I thank you, and I hope you've enjoyed hearing what I have found in my exploration and what I have put together from my own knowledge and experience. And we will return to Ron, our gracious MC.
Okay.
And we'll try to do a Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Vincent. I appreciate your presentation. Personally, I cannot think of a time in my life when I consider history to be more important than now. We're learning a lot about how we've evolved in this country as a nation, and we're repeating some of the history, some of the mistakes of our past today. And I think we have to look very carefully at the interface between history and societal evolution, and technology plays a major role in that process. You've given us a great perspective on industrial revolutions and their impact on not only our culture but our way of life as a people. And I think this is really an important start. So I want to thank you, Vincent, for that presentation. I think it was right on top, but thank you for that. We do have some.
Well, thank you, and I know the next program on AI will be further informed by this, and we'll be revisiting some of these things in the future, and we will do a walk around on camera with Steve Guerrero at the Charles River Museum, and I would urge people to, in the meantime, take a visit out there. They tend to be open about 6 or 7 hours the last 3 or 4 days of the week, and they do some really exciting programs about different topics in the evening, and some of the PBS programming is also done in conjunction with them as well, so we're in good company.
You bet. All right, let's take some questions. I see Neil's hand up. Go ahead, Neil.
Yes, I was going to say the following. AI is actually leveling the income distribution by various methods, and it turns out there's a backlash from people who are getting a lot of money but don't like the fact that they no longer have so much more money than everybody else, and and basically that's part of the reason the past election. But AI is basically, we are not going to have, everybody worries about the debt. Well, with AI, we are increasing the productivity of the society faster than the debt that is increasing. And therefore, the percentage of resources needed for debt service gets lower with time, which is very unusual. And as I say, there is this problem. There's a backlash, and the backlash is basically people who really are getting a lot of money from AI, but don't like the fact that they no longer have so much, that the income distribution is becoming level. If you want to know some of the ways it's becoming level, we have basically, it's much easier to start a new business. You could, and it's much easier to learn how to do tasks on YouTube, and that's one of the ways. And basically, it's very easy to train somebody from his low-level position to be able to take over the new higher-level position necessary by AI. And a lot of firms are doing that. And if you and I don't understand why people don't realize, they read all these things about AI is creating all these new jobs, is creating. We're learning how to do medicine better. It goes on and on. So I basically, the big thing which people don't seem to understand is that it's leveling out the actual income distribution. It's not creating.
You make some interesting points, and to one of your points there, that it's easier to do certain kinds of starting a business. Bentley University, also now in Waltham on the hill opposite from Brandeis, when I was growing up, it was a school with men who were studying for the CPA exam in accounting for Massachusetts, and that was it. Over time, the growth of business and the growth of the accounting field, more than just keeping track of bookkeeping, and how computers have allowed mathematical models and predictiveness for retail and other businesses, has grown. And in fact, Bentley is now one of the top ranked schools in training people in entrepreneurial science, as it's now called, where people can go there and learn how to start a business, as opposed to at one time people would go to college or technical school and take that skill and figure out how to start a business. So we have definitely advanced in some ways. There are opportunities there. And the interesting point, I think one or two of the most interesting points that happen with each industrial revolution is the need to alter and improve and adjust the educational curriculums that are available. And we have in Massachusetts a great system of regional voc tech schools, but there's an incredible demand for them, so that they're more exclusive than they once were. And the need to perhaps expand the seats in those regional voc tech schools and expand entrepreneurial science in our high schools and colleges as a regular part of the curriculum, as opposed to going to a special set of programs such as Bentley.
Great. You know what? Just a little bit of a corollary to Neil's question. You know, I remember during the Sputnik era hearing someone say, and I don't know who this is to attribute this to, but I remember someone saying two of the greatest human motivators are fear and greed. Fear, as a sense of Sputnik. We were concerned about Sputnik and the potential Russian dominance of space, and that put a great fear into the United States, into the world. And in fact, it led to our space program and NASA and landing on the moon and Neil Armstrong. But greed is also part of that. And Neil, I keep thinking about the fact that without guardrails, technology, if there isn't some constraint on a new technology, whatever, whether it's an automobile or a telephone or a robot walking the streets, there has to be some sort of
Impossible. I disagree. It's impossible to stop it. If we stopped it, some other country would continue on. And so so there's no, but so we're on this roller coaster and we can't get off.
Well, I think you're right in many respects. So, but I couldn't resist making the comment. Let's take some.
Well, I think the various points that I addressed, some of which from different people in the program and other reading, is how we utilize the next set of technologies. That happened with the mill girls in Waltham, in Lowell, the Knights of Labor in the late 1800s, eventually minimum wage laws and overtime rules, which did not, in fact, hurt business. Rather, it actually made business more productive, because it turns out that at about 32 to 33 hours a week, we become less productive, particularly in a mechanized environment. And so it was time and motion studies, largely by businesses, that decided a 40-hour week was a good compromise, because at 60 hours a week, there were liabilities and injuries that were disruptive. In terms of using the technology, an early example was Logan Airport. If somebody has a medical emergency in a place that has 12 million passengers a year, the nearest substantial medical hospital of quality is Mass General, which is only half an hour through the tunnels, but half an hour. They rigged up video and telephone and set up a medical clinic at Logan Airport, which has undoubtedly helped to perhaps even save many lives. And then once somebody is stabilized, they can be taken to Mass General. That's an example of using video and telephone technology that did not exist several centuries ago, let alone air flight and the ability to get to New York in a couple hours as opposed to 4 or 5 hours by vehicle. A lot of different dynamics and hybridizations that occur. The question is not whether we're going to do these things. Neil is right that progress does tend to move forward, but how we use these things and what are the guardrails and what are the disclosures publicly so people know what the choices really are underlying what they see in front of them.
Good. Let's move on. Let's go to Eddie.
Yeah, hi, Vincent. Thank you very much for your talk. You actually, a lot of what you've been talking about is related to the question I was going to ask, which is the adaptation of society to new technologies. I believe during the Iron Age, for example, the whole Indian subcontinent more or less transformed because of the invention of basically iron plows. And that essentially created huge land ownership for some people who were at the forefront of adapting to the new technology, to the new metal, and left a lot of people sort of hanging around, which eventually led, I think, to new religious orders as well being created and the entire society changing. So the question really is, I suppose it's just kind of a split mode. One is how do we adapt to these new technologies, and how do we avoid perhaps creating societies essentially that are almost on the form of rebellion or moving into, I don't want to say fantasy, but in order to protect themselves, essentially start creating more than just Luddites, but actually a social revolution that can actually prevent the thing from coming forth.
Interesting points. I take your point about India. That has been true in the West and even in the United States. If you are in the early 1700s, perhaps 92 of every 100 people were involved directly in agriculture or the direct proceeds of that. Today, the last time I saw a few years ago, 1 out of 150 Americans is involved in agriculture, and yet they are more productive, not just in larger farms, which used to be 40 or 50 acres, now 500 or more acres, but also more highly productive and sometimes more organically friendly. And that has been a transformation because the United States now produces an enormous amount of wealth from agriculture that the average person doesn't think about, far more so when people were struggling to feed themselves in the 16 or 1700s. So the question is, again, not whether we do this, but how we do it. And ethical and religious systems do transform. And some of the religious movements, good and bad, in the 1800s came about from preachers preying on people who felt having lost control, and others who had the wealth to do whatever they wanted. Interestingly enough, wealthy people mostly still want to work, perhaps 6 hours a day, not 10, but they often eventually do become charitable in constructive ways. One of the more interesting one is Andrew Carnegie, who decided that people should read books like him and went about building Carnegie libraries across the landscape nearby. If you're ever in Revere, just off of Broadway, look for the public library. It's a gorgeous building built by Andrew Carnegie that still serves its purpose to this day. Libraries themselves have proven among the more adaptable institutions, originally private subscription libraries, today with computers and job search materials, and even things that are now called library of things. Who knew? Not just books.
Yeah. You know,
You've got the Bill Gates versus the masks today as well.
all right. Thank you. One of the things I've noticed about historians is they always answer questions with a very detailed and comprehensive answer. That's another way of saying long, Vincent. But I appreciate your comment. I'm teasing you. Let's go on to Dan. Dan Metley.
So a couple of things that sort of sparked my interest in the earlier conversations. They go back to my sort of undergraduate years at Caltech, where I studied medieval history, and then my studying of science and technology at Berkeley. The medieval history one is particularly memorable. There's a marvelous book which I think is still in print by a medieval historian, Lynn White, called uh, Medieval Technology and Social Change. And it's a series of case studies of how medieval technologies produce fundamental changes in the society. And the one that still sits in my memory is the introduction of a centralized hearth in medieval castles and buildings. So I would strongly recommend this for people interested in in considering these things, because it does look at a period of time where we don't pay nearly as much attention as we might. The second book that I am still impressed with was sparked by Neil's conversation about autonomous technologies. And that is, once you get on, you can't get off. And there's a marvelous book by a French sociologist and social philosopher by the name of Jacques Ellul, Ellul, called The Technological Society. And he brings to bear a series of very interesting arguments about why, in fact, Neil's position is not at all an unreasonable one. So both of these things, both of these books, if you're interested, would be well worth your time taking a look at.
Dan, that's a wonderful idea. Could you circulate that information on the book titles? And I'm not sure if that
Yes,
book is medieval book.
let me try to put it in the chat.
Good. And well, send it to me by email. That would be more easy.
Okay.
I can forward that on to people.
That would be great.
Okay.
Dan has produced the bibliography I didn't have time to add to my presentation.
Yeah, but I'm just curious, Dan, if one of these books is a medieval volume, is it accessible online in some fashion?
I don't know if it's online, but I did a quick check of Amazon. It came out, I think, in 65 or 6, and it is still in print.
That's amazing.
By the way, there is also another resource if something is out of print that is growing in importance called the Internet Archive. And it has all kinds of books that are not in print. It's a tremendous site, and
Yeah.
it actually simulates the turning of a page as you're reading a book electronically.
Oh my goodness. Well, this is great information. I appreciate that, Dan, and I'll make sure the rest of our crew gets what you can send me. That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Happy to do so.
Let's go on to Avi.
Vince, a question about this. We hear so much about income inequality, really wealth inequality. I hear that complaint, not from people in the middle class, but more affluent people who are politically left of center and for political purposes. My question is, when I think back to the turn of the last century, there was such enormous disparity between the people at the lowest level, some of whom you talked about in your talk, the mill girls, and the people who were more affluent, that I wonder if the difference between the very low and the very high back 120 years ago was really less than it is now.
That's an interesting question. One wonders at times, economic historians who focus on that And there's a even more obscure discipline called economic anthropology, which looks at how societies change from one economic model to another, the most obvious being a barter economy that becomes a currency or money economy. Um, there's evidence that these things are somewhat cyclical, that at some point a great pool of wealth happens with somebody who's way ahead of the curve. Often, not always, these people then provide money to urge public education curriculums on a broader scale or higher quality private curriculums. And that I think levels things in a voluntary way that not everyone expects, because there's this sort of stereotype that's only partly true that a wealthy person is about wealth, when in many cases, like a Bill Gates or a Mitch Kapoor or others, they happen to do something that happened to be at a moment in time where they could harvest a great amount of money. And some of them are more charitable than others. But I think these things vary. To many peoples, the work of a Soviet economist, going back some years, I'll provide some of this information, thought that there was a 25-year upcycle and a 25-year down cycle in Western economics. He did some incredible path-breaking econometric research, even going to look at ship cargo inventories at English ports and the cycles they had. For his troubles, the Soviets put him in jail because he said, well, the value of communism is when things are tough, it will provide money and resources to people. And they said, that's all you can say for us? You're in jail. But his work is rather interesting. And this is a long-running argument. Of course, all of us at some point pass on to a next world. And so then the really funny and acerbic comment of Reverend Peter Gomes at Harvard is when people say, how much of it are you going to take with you? And the answer is nothing. All of us reach a point where the wealth becomes in somebody else's hands. More importantly, marketplaces, to the extent that they're free and open, require more people to have money in hand so they can buy the products and services. So sometimes in our system, tax profiles get adjusted as too high or too low. It's a long-running argument. The most important part, I think, is that we can have that long-running argument and make adjustments from time to time. And in our federal system, there's at least 50 states and others that really are separate countries with their own economic policies. So New York and Massachusetts and California and Texas have very different economies intersecting with us all, but able to define things in different and often competing ways, hopefully peacefully. And that was the success of Western Europe, that Paul-Henri Spaak said, we need a United States of Europe where people are able to have commerce with each other as opposed to have war with each other.
Thanks, Vincent. I'm always mindful of the clock. We have three more questions and we have about 5 more minutes. And so
Okay, this is the lightning round.
yeah, this is the lightning round, but let's move on. I do appreciate I gotta say, your presentation was wonderful, but the Q&A is absolutely stunning, and I'm just so pleased by this whole exercise. But nevertheless, let's go on to Marv. Let me introduce Marv. I describe Marv as a technological philosopher, and I think that's an important description. Then Marv, go ahead. You've got a comment, I'm sure.
Um, well, we're going to be doing.
Marv, we're losing the audio somehow.
Do you hear me at this point?
Yeah.
Okay, I do not know what's going on. Okay, a month from now, we're going to be doing a wrap up, which will be AI focused. I think it's sort of interesting that we're going to take a slightly different approach, which I'll come to in 1 second. This conversation has been like every other conversation, no matter what the area, politics, economics, philosophy, science. AI cannot now not be a part of a conversation. And that's become a reality. for a very short period of time. I've been actively involved in AI for about 40 years, but very intensely for the last 25 years. And this is, the penetration, the thought processes are amazing. And we're all sort of the three blind men with the elephant. We're looking backwards now with history in this conversation, which I think is fabulous, at the history of industrial revolutions. But we're also projecting forward what the future is going to be. And we don't know where it's going to be, but because it's penetrating so many areas, and all of you have different areas of expertise, um, AI is not, there is no area in our society that will not be impacted. Sports, you can name it. That's not, and it's not long-term, it's short-term impact. So what we're going to be trying to do is actually turn this into a discussion, but a more built one in the sense that we would like your input. And Ron and I discussed this the other day, we'll be sending out an email with your perspectives, questions ahead of time, and even those who might want to present for 3 to 5 minutes something about how AI is impacting your world. I would posit, and this is relevant to today's conversation, that where we are now differs from historical industrial revolutions in two fundamental ways. One we're all experiencing, which is the speed. I don't think any prior industrial revolution has impacted us. Give context. You could ask for a show of hands, but how many of you gave daily thought to AI prior to November 30th, 2022? Okay, one. Me, daily intensive. Since then, everybody is. This is less than 2.5 years, approximately 2.5 years. So almost to the day. That we're living in a totally different world. So speed is a big deal. But the second thing I'd like you to ponder is that, and Vincent, you can correct me on this. It appears, and it's been my experience, that prior industrial revolutions have been fundamentally about labor and materials and productivity in measurable external ways. I would correlate this a little bit more to the Copernican revolution that took us out of being the center of the physical universe, which of course had serious implications for the churches and many other sciences. We are dealing now with something that's not physical, but cognitive. And the revolution could well be that we are, in a Copernican sense, being taken out of being the center of the cognitive revolution, center of the world. And the question that I have for you to ponder is, what does that mean? What does it mean in your areas of expertise? Where we're not talking about replacing labor. Yes, that'll happen through robotics, all of it's AI driven. I'm not saying that's not happening, but that the fundamental change that's happening is basically, what does it mean if there's a weird picture behind me. And you may recognize that as a reflection in Rockport from a bowl outside of the Bean Cafe, if you've ever walked by. I'm a photographer, I'm an artist. I can tell you that the work of artists has been significantly modified in terms of its value, basically devalued.
Well,
Over the last few,
cognizant
excuse
of
me?
the time, Marv, I could give a half-hour lecture on what you just asked as a statement or question. But the Copernican revolution is of some interest, and I think there's a good parallel to that.
Mhm.
People were sort of appalled. You mean we're not the center of everything? You mean the sun doesn't go around us?
Yeah,
But
that's
think of
exactly the point.
how that freed people to think of things in a totally different way and think of the progress that that led to, because no longer were people thinking about how we're in charge of everything, but how we have to listen and interact with everybody and a broader cosmology. And I think it's not accidental that Carol Wojtyła, a major faculty member of Krakow University from a country that had Copernicus, Copernicus figured out that we went around the sun without complete evidence. Galileo tried to prove it, and they threw him in jail. And to these days, people think the Italians are liberals and the Poles are reactionaries. Go figure. By saying that we're not the center of everything, it forces us to use our other senses to see what else we can do or learn, because we are restlessly curious as human beings, good and bad. And I think the jury perhaps is still out, or maybe there will be a retrial. But in essence, it will free us to think in ways we hadn't ever allowed us to think before, because the dynamic of the things we've created is now interacting with us at a higher level than we had ever planned on.
Good, good. Let's go on. We really do we have two other questions. Eddie, and then Albert, and we'll call it a day. Eddie?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to expand a bit on what Marv was talking about. It's strange that the amount of power now that will be devoted to AI once it really gets going is going to be at the service of AI, which is supposedly going to be at the service of us still. But it seems to me that in past generations, the industrial revolutions were essentially to give humans more energy that enabled us to create higher civilizations. But and you can look at the Kardashev scale if anyone wants to take a look at that. But I think missing from the Kardashev scale is who is the energy going to serve. Eventually, one will have to wonder whether or not that energy is not going to serve humanity, but in fact serve the AIs that we have developed. And that is where we run into, I think, this horror of potentially replacing ourselves with AI.
Eddie, I think you make an interesting point that in some ways intersects with the prior point about Copernican. I remember
Right.
at daily prayers at Harvard one day, a rabbi spoke in an interesting way, analytically, as many rabbis have the capacity to do. And he said, there is a tradition in Judaism that you should say the same prayer carefully each time as though it is a new prayer, so that you might gain new insight from the same words you think you knew. And I think in some ways AI does that, because AI at its best is still in some ways a mirror of us in certain ways. And like Rosarian therapy, playing back to us allows us to think about ourselves and this new mechanism.
Very good.
I've got a few comments to that, but I'll leave it.
This is setting the stage beautifully for June 27th. So let's take Albert's question and
Well, there was one very short, one sentence
yeah.
of thought for you to think about if you think towards the 27th and what we're going to ask from you. And that is, this is like a cone of uncertainty for a hurricane. We have a general sense where it's moving. We know it's powerful, but where it's going to land, and that's what I would like you guys to think of in terms of what your expertise is. What is the cone of uncertainty of how AI will play out? That's it.
That's a good way of putting it. I like that. Albert, you have the last word today, so go
Okay.
through.
2 points. First, I'd like to second what Eddie said in terms of his concern of who will ultimately be served. Second, a comment on the earlier statement that digitalization and AI is making a lot of people become entrepreneur and equalizing life a little bit on that level. I see that happening. A lot of students, all they want to do is become entrepreneurs. And there's so many of them, and they're all enamored, fascinated by what entrepreneurship can produce for them. The problem is much less attention is being given to the hard problem of society that needs to be addressed. I see even people coming to MIT mainly to take that one course which put engineers and MBAs together in the class and have them essentially produce a business plan by the end of the session, by the end of one term, and they want to act on that and go. So they didn't come to study. They came only to get that business plan and go with it. There's some disadvantage to that. So I don't agree that all these new tools are enabling people to be entrepreneurs so easily, and that's good for society. I think there's big drawbacks to that.
I think that's a very fair statement, Albert. My sense is that technology is at its best when it serves a useful social purpose. And I'm not convinced that all of the technology we're talking about meets that criterion. So I think there's a real issue there. And I hope, I have to say that this has been a really wonderful conversation, not only in terms of the presentation, but this discussion's really been, this is world-class stuff. And I think this has set the stage beautifully for our wrap up when we get together at the end of June. We have another presentation the next time we meet on, I guess it's what is it, June 14th, June 13th, I guess.
15th will be
Yeah.
13.
Yeah, that will be on high temperature superconductors, which represent another dimension in terms of a technological, maybe not a revolution, but certainly an evolution that has incredible potential consequences. So we're going to hear from Amit Goyal, who's a professor at State University of New York in Buffalo. He'll talk with us about superconductors, and then on June 27th, we'll wrap up this season with a conversation on AI. So we have a lot in front of us, guys. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Ron, for the opportunity, and
Yeah.
I'm glad that we're able to stimulate some first-class thinking for our first-class group.
Yeah. Thank you, Vincent. Great presentation. Take care, everybody. See you in 2 weeks.
Thanks, Vince.
Okay. Bye-bye.